The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from Arthur Jensen's fingertips and the warmth from his breath, leaving a cloud of white vapor in the biting November wind. It was a physical cold, the kind that seeped through the worn threads of his old army field jacket and settled deep in his bones. But there was another, more profound chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of invisibility, of being a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had moved on without him. He stood near the entrance of the 24/7 gas station, not begging, not even making eye contact, just trying to absorb the phantom heat that bled through the glass doors every time a customer bustled in or out. The smell of gasoline, stale coffee, and wet pavement was the perfume of his purgatory. People's eyes slid over him, a reflexive, practiced avoidance that registered him as nothing more than a piece of unfortunate scenery, a human pothole to be navigated around. Inside his pocket, his frozen fingers were curled around his entire net worth, $4.73. The coins were a familiar, meager weight against his palm. For the last hour, he'd been locked in a silent, desperate debate. A large, steaming coffee from the convenience store would be a luxury, a way to chase the ache from his joints and feel something other than numb. But a can of beef stew, heated over a small fire in the sheltered alcove behind the abandoned warehouse he called home, would mean a full stomach. It was a choice between immediate comfort and future sustenance, a calculation he had to make a dozen times a day. He leaned against the brick wall, his posture unnaturally straight, a relic of a life where his spine had been forged by discipline and purpose. He watched the cars pull in and out, a parade of ordinary lives in motion. A mother scolding her kids in the back seat of a minivan, a teenager blasting music from a beat-up sedan, a couple laughing as they headed inside for road trip snacks. They were all part of a current, and he was a rock stuck in the riverbed, the water of life flowing around him, eroding him slowly. His gaze fell on his own reflection in the grimy window. He saw a man he barely recognized. The face was gaunt, etched with lines of hardship and sleepless nights. His hair was long and matted, his beard untrimmed. But his eyes were the same. They were a pale, clear blue that still held a flicker of the man he used to be. Sergeant Arthur Jensen, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. A man who had once led other men, who had known the fierce, terrifying clarity of combat and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. Now that man was a ghost, and this hollowed-out shell was all that remained. The decision was made. The stew. Survival always won. He pushed himself off the wall, the movement stiff and painful, and prepared to walk the 2 miles to the discount grocery store when a sound cut through the mundane noise of the station. It was the purr of a high-performance engine, a low, predatory growl that made every other car sound like a toy. A glossy black Mercedes S-Class, so polished it reflected the gray, overcast sky like a dark mirror, slid silently to a stop at the premium pump. The driver's door opened, and a man in a tailored charcoal suit emerged. He was the physical embodiment of wealth and privilege, from his gleaming Italian leather shoes to the expensive watch on his wrist. He was talking loudly into a Bluetooth earpiece, his voice a sharp, arrogant bark that sliced through the air. "I don't care what their offer is, you tell them my floor is $2 million. Not a penny less. Make it happen." He moved with an unearned confidence, a man accustomed to the world bending to his will. As he pulled the gas nozzle, his movements were slick and impatient. From his pocket, he withdrew a money clip thick with $100 bills. In his haste, a single $20 bill slipped from the clip, caught by the wind, and fluttered to the ground, landing near the toe of Arthur's worn combat boot. Arthur's first instinct was to ignore it. He wanted no interaction, no attention. But his training, the deeply ingrained code of conduct from a lifetime ago, wouldn't allow it. You didn't take what wasn't yours. You did the right thing even when no one was watching. He bent down, his knees cracking in protest, and picked up the bill. He walked toward the man, holding it out. "Excuse me, sir," Arthur said, his voice raspy from disuse. "You dropped this." The man, whose name was Richard Sterling, ended his call with a sharp click and turned. His eyes, cold and dismissive, raked over Arthur from head to toe. A sneer twisted his lips. He didn't see a man returning his money. He saw a piece of filth, an opportunist. "Oh, I'm sure I did," Sterling said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He snatched the bill from Arthur's hand as if it were contaminated. "Nice try, though. What's your game? Pick it up and then hope I give you a reward for your troubles." Arthur said nothing. He simply held the man's gaze, his own expression unreadable. This silent defiance seemed to infuriate Sterling even more. "Look at the state of you," Sterling continued, his voice rising, drawing the attention of other customers. "A real American hero, I'm sure." He made a show of wiping the $20 bill on his pristine trousers before tucking it back into his money clip. Then, in a final act of theatrical contempt, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of loose change, and tossed it onto the greasy pavement at Arthur's feet. The pennies and dimes scattered with a series of tiny, metallic clicks. "Here," Sterling spat. "This is more your speed. Go on, pick it up. Buy yourself a bottle of something cheap to forget what a waste you are." The copper coins glinted on the dark, oil-stained concrete. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to those small, insignificant discs of metal. They were more than just money. They were a judgment, a final, public declaration of his worthlessness in the eyes of men like Richard Sterling. But Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't stoop. He didn't even look down. Instead, the insult triggered something deep within him, an echo from a place of dust and fire. His mind, for a fleeting second, left the cold gas station and was back in the Karangal Valley. The air was thin and hot, thick with the smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fear. He was 24 years old, a sergeant leading his squad on a patrol. He remembered the face of Corporal Miller, a kid from Ohio with a goofy grin and pictures of his high school sweetheart taped inside his helmet. They were pinned down, the rhythmic chatter of an enemy machine gun kicking up dirt and rock all around them. Miller had been hit. Arthur had crawled through a storm of bullets, ignoring the shouts of his men, to get to him. He remembered the feeling of Miller's warm blood soaking through his fatigues, the desperate, futile pressure of his hands on the wound. Miller had looked up at him, his eyes wide with shock and a terrifying, dawning acceptance. "Tell Sarah I love her, Sarge," he'd whispered, his breath catching. "Tell my folks. Tell them I was brave." Arthur had made that promise. He had held Miller's hand as the life faded from him, the Afghan sun beating down on them both. After his tour, he had tried to keep that promise. He'd visited the family in their small Ohio town. He saw the hollowed-out grief in their eyes, a grief he felt he had personally delivered to their doorstep. He saw the shrine they'd made in their son's bedroom. He saw Sarah, the high school sweetheart, who looked at him not with gratitude, but with a kind of shattered accusation, as if his survival was an insult to Miller's death. The weight of it all had been too much. The nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the feeling that he was an imposter in a world of peace he no longer understood. His marriage had crumbled, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing whimper. His wife couldn't reach the man who had come back, the stranger who sat in silence for hours, staring at walls that were not there. He lost his job, then his apartment, then himself. He hadn't fallen into homelessness. He had retreated into it, a self-imposed exile from a world where he felt he didn't belong, a penance for the sin of living when better men had died. All of this flashed through his mind in the space of a heartbeat. It was the bedrock of his endurance. He had faced down men with guns who wanted to kill him. He had watched friends die in his arms. The petty cruelty of a man like Richard Sterling was nothing. It was a gnat buzzing around a monument of pain. He straightened his back, the movement almost imperceptible, but it was a conscious act of defiance. He lifted his chin slightly. His drill instructor, a terrifying man named Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, had screamed it into their souls on the first day of basic training. "Your body may fail, your spirit may break, but your bearing is yours to command until your last breath. You will stand like a soldier, you will act like a soldier, you will be a soldier, no matter what hell you are in." In this cold, miserable hell, Arthur Jensen was still a soldier. He would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing him break. He held Sterling's gaze, his pale blue eyes clear and steady, and in their depths, there was not hatred, but a profound and weary pity. The small audience at the gas station was frozen in a state of awkward paralysis. Leo, the young cashier with acne and a perpetually bored expression, watched from behind the safety of the plexiglass barrier. His hands were paused over the register, his face a mixture of fear and disgust. He knew he should say something, do something, but the man in the suit radiated an aura of dangerous importance, and Leo was just a kid making minimum wage. Intervening felt like stepping in front of a speeding train. A woman in a worn winter coat, pumping gas into a sputtering station wagon, had turned her back, pulling her young son closer as if shielding him from the moral contagion of the scene. She whispered for him to look at the pretty clouds, a desperate attempt to distract from the ugliness unfolding just a few feet away. Another man, beefy and wearing a contractor's sweatshirt, simply shook his head and focused intently on cleaning his windshield, his squeegee moving with an aggressive, deliberate rhythm that signaled his refusal to get involved. Their collective silence was a form of consent. It created a vacuum that Richard Sterling was more than happy to fill with his own venom. He seemed to draw energy from their passive observation, his cruelty swelling to fill the space. "What's the matter?" Sterling taunted, taking a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was cloying, an obscene contrast to the station's gritty smells. "Nothing to say? I'm talking to you." Arthur remained a statue of quiet endurance. His gaze was fixed on a point just over Sterling's shoulder, a discolored patch of brick on the station wall. He was employing a technique he'd learned in SEER training: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. When being psychologically broken down by an enemy, you create a mental fortress. You focus on something small and real, and you hold on to it. You detach. You endure. His silence was a weapon Sterling didn't understand, and it enraged him. "You people are all the same," Sterling hissed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "You think you're owed something because you put on a uniform for a couple of years. You're not heroes. You're leeches. My taxes pay for your pathetic existence. The money I make, the business I build. That's what makes this country great. Not bums like you cluttering up the scenery." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to pierce Arthur's dignity. But Arthur's dignity wasn't a fragile thing. It was a core of hardened steel, forged in crucible Sterling couldn't possibly imagine. He had long since stopped caring what the world thought of him. His battle was internal, a daily struggle to honor the memories of the fallen and to find a reason to see the sunrise one more time. The pressure in the air was thick and suffocating. It was the pressure of a dozen people choosing not to be brave, not to speak up for a man being systematically humiliated. Their inaction was a quiet chorus, harmonizing with Sterling's solo of contempt. And Arthur stood in the middle of it all, utterly alone, weathering a storm of words that was, in its own way, as violent as any hailstorm of bullets he had ever faced. He just had to wait for it to pass. It always passed. Just as Sterling seemed to be winding up for another verbal assault, a new sound intruded. It was the sputtering cough of an old, rusted-out sedan pulling up to the pump opposite the Mercedes. The car died with a final, shuddering gasp. A young woman, looking exhausted and frayed at the edges, got out. She was holding a crying baby wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket. Her face was pale with worry. She fumbled with the gas cap, her hands shaking, and then tried to pay at the pump with a credit card. It was declined. She tried again. Declined. A wave of panic washed over her features. She walked towards the cashier's window, her voice trembling as she spoke into the crackling intercom. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over her baby's cries. "Can I just get $5 worth? I just need to get to the women's shelter on the other side of town. Please." Leo's voice came back, full of institutional regret.
"I'm sorry, Mom.
Pump won't authorize for less than 10 on a prepaid. And your card isn't working." Sterling let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's like they breed." Another one with her hand out, the young woman's shoulders slumped in defeat. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from her empty fuel gauge to her wailing child. It was a portrait of pure, unadulterated desperation. At that moment, something inside Arthur shifted. The defensive shell he had built around himself cracked. He saw not just a stranger in trouble, but a reflection of a deeper, more pervasive brokenness in the world. He saw a fight that needed fighting. He turned, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked away from Sterling. He ignored the scattered coins at his feet. He ignored the man who had just tried to strip him of his humanity. He walked directly to the young woman. She flinched as he approached, instinctively clutching her baby tighter, conditioned to see a man like him as a threat. Arthur stopped a few feet away, giving her space. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out his entire fortune, the folded $4 bill and the handful of loose change. He smoothed the bill out with his thumb and held it all out to her in his calloused palm. "It's not much," he said, his voice quiet but clear, the words carrying a profound weight. "But I hope it helps you get where you're going, ma'am." The woman stared at the offering, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief. She looked from the pathetic sum of money to the face of the man offering it. A man who clearly had nothing. I can't take that," she stammered. "You need it more than I do." Arthur took another step forward and gently took her free hand, pressing the money into it. He closed her fingers around the bill and coins. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes," he said. He gave a small, formal nod, a gesture that was both respectful and final. Then, without waiting for another word, he turned and walked back to his spot against the cold brick wall, his pockets now completely empty. The act was so pure, so unexpected. It hung in the air like a thunderclap, rendering all other noise and motion irrelevant. The selfless act, a quiet explosion of grace in a landscape of indifference, fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the gas station. It was as if a spell had been broken. Richard Sterling, who had been the center of the drama, was suddenly a footnote. His cruelty, which had seemed so powerful moments before, now looked petty and pathetic in the face of such profound generosity. He stood there, mouth slightly agape, his intended insults dying on his lips. He simply could not compute what he had just witnessed. A man he had deemed worthless had just performed an act of charity that he, with his millions, would never have contemplated. The sight of it short-circuited his entire worldview. Leo, the cashier, leaned against the glass, his cynical teenage facade crumbling. He had seen 1,000 transactions that day, all of them meaningless exchanges of money for goods. But this was different. This was a transaction of the human spirit. He looked at Arthur, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not a vagrant, but a man of immense character. A deep, unfamiliar feeling of shame washed over him for having stood by and done nothing. The mother with the station wagon, who had been trying to shield her son, now turned to face the scene head-on. She met Arthur's gaze from across the lot and gave him a slow, deliberate nod of respect. She pulled her son a little closer, but this time it was not to hide him, but to ensure he was watching, learning a lesson that no school could ever teach. Even the contractor cleaning his windshield had stopped, his squeegee held motionless in midair. He stared at Arthur, his brow furrowed in thought, his earlier dismissal replaced by a grudging, then growing admiration. The entire social dynamic had been inverted. The homeless man was now the figure of authority, his quiet dignity commanding a respect that Sterling's wealth and bluster could never buy. But there was one other observer who had not moved, who had remained a silent fixture at the far edge of the station's lot. A man was sitting astride a dusty, black Harley-Davidson Road Glide, the engine off. He was large, built like a mountain, with a thick, graying beard that covered the lower half of his face. On his back was a leather cut, the top rocker patch reading Hell's Angels in bold, blood-red letters. He had been there for 10 minutes, waiting for a brother to meet him. He had seen everything. He saw Sterling's arrogance, heard his taunts. He saw the community's silent complicity. And he saw Arthur's unyielding spine, his quiet refusal to be broken. Most importantly, he saw the final, selfless act. He watched Arthur give away his last few dollars without a moment's hesitation. The biker, whose road name was Sarge, took a long, slow drag from his hand-rolled cigarette, the cherry glowing brightly in the dimming afternoon light. His eyes, narrowed and sharp, missed no detail. He had spent 20 years in the Marine Corps before trading one brotherhood for another. He knew a soldier's bearing when he saw it. He recognized the ramrod posture, the thousand-yard stare, the profound and unshakable dignity that came only from surviving the unimaginable. He exhaled a plume of smoke. His gaze shifted from Arthur, now standing alone and penniless, to the gleaming Mercedes. He memorized the license plate. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled out an old flip phone, a relic that couldn't be tracked easily. He dialed a number from memory. When a gruff voice answered, Sarge didn't waste words. "Preacher, it's me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Change of plans. Gather the boys. I've got an address for you. We've got a piece of trash to take out, and a brother to look after." An hour crawled by. The world, for a time, seemed to slip back into its normal rhythm. The young mother, after a tearful and insistent thank you to Arthur, had gotten her $5 worth of gas and driven away, her baby finally quiet. The other customers had finished their business and departed, leaving the station feeling strangely empty. Richard Sterling, having recovered some of his bluster, paid for his gas and climbed back into the climate-controlled sanctuary of his Mercedes. He sat there for a few minutes, making another important call, his face a mask of smug self-satisfaction. The incident, in his mind, was already forgotten, a minor annoyance in a day of closing deals and asserting his dominance. Arthur, meanwhile, felt the cold returning with a vengeance. The brief warmth of his good deed was no match for the wind that whipped around the corner of the building. His stomach growled, a hollow reminder of the meal he had given away. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold brick, and tried to find his mental fortress again. Then he heard it. It started as a faint, low-frequency vibration, a tremor in the soles of his worn boots. It was a feeling more than a sound, a deep hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a distinct, guttural roar. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day, the sound of an approaching army. Arthur opened his eyes. Over the crest of the small hill leading to the highway, a single headlight appeared. Then another, and another, until a constellation of bright, menacing lights burned through the twilight. An angry wave of chrome, steel, and black leather was rolling towards them. They poured into the gas station lot not as a loose collection of riders, but as a single, cohesive unit. There were at least 30 of them, Hell's Angels. Their engines, a symphony of controlled explosions, filled the air with a deafening, intimidating chorus. They moved with the disciplined precision of a cavalry charge, peeling off one by one to form a perfect, suffocating circle around Richard Sterling's black Mercedes. The sheer presence of them was overwhelming. They were large men, weathered and hard, their faces set like stone. Their leather cuts were adorned with patches that spoke of long roads and hard lives. They said nothing. They revved their engines in unison once, a deafening blast of sound that vibrated the windows of the convenience store. And then, as if on a silent command, they all cut their engines at the exact same time. The sudden, profound silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise had ever been. It was a heavy, menacing silence, thick with unspoken threat. Sterling, who had been on his phone, looked up, his face draining of all color. He saw the wall of bikers surrounding him, their expressions unreadable but universally hostile. His world of tailored suits and boardroom negotiations had just been violently invaded by a reality he had only seen in movies. Sarge, the biker who had made the call, swung his leg over his Harley and walked with a slow, deliberate gait toward the driver's side window of the Mercedes. His boots crunched on the gravel, the only sound in the dead quiet. He stopped beside the door and simply stood there, waiting. He was in no hurry. He folded his thick arms across his chest. Inside the car, Sterling was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unbuckle his seatbelt. He was trapped. There was no escape. The world had shrunk to the interior of his luxury car and the terrifying, silent judgment of the men who surrounded it. Sarge raised a hand, his knuckles as thick as walnuts, and tapped twice on the tinted window. The sound was sharp, precise, and impossibly loud in the silence. Inside, Richard Sterling flinched as if from a gunshot. After a moment of terrified hesitation, the window slid down a few inches, revealing a sliver of his pale, sweating face. "We need to have a conversation," Sarge said. His voice was not a shout, but a low, gravelly rumble that carried an absolute authority. "It's about respect. It's a concept you might not be familiar with, so we're here to provide a practical demonstration." He didn't mention Arthur. Not yet. He let the vague, ominous nature of the statement hang in the air, allowing Sterling's imagination to fill in the terrifying blanks. "This patch on my back," Sarge continued, gesturing with his thumb over his shoulder. "It means family. It means loyalty. We have a code. We don't tolerate disrespect. Not to us, and not to people who've earned better." Just then, the convenience store door swung open. Leo, the cashier, stepped out into the cold air. The arrival of the bikers had ignited a spark of courage in him. He was no longer a scared kid. He was a witness. He walked toward the circle of motorcycles, his steps hesitant but determined. "That man?" Leo said, his voice cracking slightly but gaining strength with every word, as he pointed a trembling finger toward Arthur, who was watching the scene unfold with a stunned, bewildered expression. "The one you called trash. The one you threw pennies at. I saw what he did. He gave his last cent to a woman who needed gas for her baby. His last cent. He's a better man than you'll ever be." Sarge gave Leo a slow, appreciative nod before turning his cold eyes back to Sterling. "We know," he said calmly. "We also know who he is. We have friends in all sorts of places. We made a call. We ran his name. Arthur Jensen. Sergeant, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment." Sarge paused, letting each word land with the force of a hammer blow. "He did 2 tours in Afghanistan. Earned a Silver Star for pulling his men out of an ambush under heavy fire. Got a Purple Heart for taking shrapnel that almost cost him his leg. He's a man who watched his brothers die protecting the very freedom you use to get rich and bully the weak." The information was a bombshell dropped into the middle of the gas station. It was a public revelation, delivered for all to hear. The few other people who had pulled in during the last hour now stared at Arthur with a mixture of awe and deep, profound shame. He was no longer an anonymous homeless man. His identity, his history of sacrifice had been restored. He was Sergeant Arthur Jensen, a hero who had fallen through the cracks of the very society he had fought to protect. Sterling slumped in his seat, the last of his arrogance dissolving into a puddle of pure, pathetic fear. The man he had humiliated was not a nobody. He was a warrior, and that warrior now had an army of leather-clad angels standing at his back. The justice delivered by the bikers was not one of physical violence. It was colder, more precise, and far more humiliating. Sarge leaned down, his face close to the opening of the window. "You're going to fix this," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "You're going to take out that fat wallet of yours. You're going to empty it, every last bill, and you're going to hand it over. Then you're going to get out of this car, you're going to walk over to Sergeant Jensen, and you're going to apologize to him. You will look him in the eye when you do it." Sterling, trembling like a leaf, fumbled for his wallet. His usually nimble fingers were clumsy with fear. He pulled it out. It was thick with cash. He hesitated for a second, a flicker of his old self trying to calculate the cost. Sarge saw the hesitation and leaned in closer. "Now," he growled. Defeated, Sterling pulled out the wad of bills, nearly $800, and passed it through the window. A younger biker, one with the word prospect on his vest, took the money without a word and walked it over to Arthur, holding it out. Arthur just stared at the cash, a look of utter confusion on his face. He shook his head, as if to refuse it. Sarge saw this and walked over to Arthur himself. He looked the old soldier up and down, a deep, knowing respect in his eyes. He didn't offer him the money. Instead, he did something far more significant. With slow, deliberate movements, he unzipped his own leather cut, the symbol of his identity, his rank, his entire way of life, and shrugged it off his massive shoulders. The vest was heavy, worn, and smelled of leather, road dust, and engine oil. It was a sacred object. "We don't carry spares," Sarge said, his voice softer now, full of a gruff reverence. "But a man of your caliber deserves to be warm. A ranger should never be cold." He held the vest open, and gently, respectfully, helped Arthur slide his arms into it. The heavy leather settled over Arthur's thin frame like a suit of armor. It was more than a gesture of kindness. It was an induction, a profound statement of solidarity and belonging. Once the vest was settled on Arthur's shoulders, Sarge turned his attention back to Sterling, who had finally, shakily, gotten out of his car. "Go on," Sarge ordered. Sterling shuffled over to Arthur, his expensive shoes scuffing on the gritty pavement. He couldn't meet Arthur's eyes, his gaze fixed on the ground. I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Look at him." Sarge's voice cracked like a whip. Sterling flinched and forced himself to look up into Arthur's pale blue eyes. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice a pathetic squeak. Arthur simply nodded, his expression unreadable. The apology was meaningless to him, but the ritual was important. Sarge then turned to the prospect holding the cash and gestured for him to give it to Arthur. "For a hot meal and a decent roof over your head tonight," Sarge said. And this he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a worn business card with nothing but a name, Sarge, and a phone number on it. "You call this number if you need anything at all. Someone will answer, day or night. We look after our own." With that, the lesson was over. The bikers turned from Arthur and formed a phalanx around the Mercedes. They didn't touch the car, but their message was clear. They escorted Sterling out of the gas station and onto the highway, a terrifying honor guard ensuring he left town and never, ever came back. The bikers did not linger. Their purpose had been served, their point brutally and effectively made. As the last of Sterling's Mercedes disappeared over the horizon, flanked by a roaring sea of Harleys, the remaining members of the chapter mounted their bikes. They gave Arthur a collective nod, a silent salute from one warrior to another. Then, in a final, deafening crescendo, they fired up their engines. The sound was no longer a threat, but a tribute, a thunderous acknowledgement of his courage and dignity. They roared out of the station lot and down the highway, their taillights shrinking into the deepening dusk until they were gone, leaving behind a silence that was profoundly different from the one that had preceded them. It was a silence filled with respect. Arthur stood alone in the center of the lot, the heavy Hell's Angels vest a warm, protective weight on his shoulders. In his hand, he clutched the wad of cash and the small, significant business card. The cold no longer seemed to bite so deeply. The weight on his soul felt lighter. He was still homeless, still broken in many ways, but he was no longer invisible. He was no longer alone. The door to the convenience store opened again. Leo the cashier walked out, holding a large, steaming cup of coffee. He approached Arthur not with fear or pity, but with a deep and humbling deference. "This is on the house, sir," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. He used the word sir without a trace of irony. "And thank you for your service." He met Arthur's eyes, and for the first time, Arthur allowed himself to meet the gaze of another person without flinching. He took the coffee, his fingers wrapping around the warm cup. "Thank you," he murmured. A moment later, the rusted sedan from earlier pulled back into the lot. The young mother got out, her baby now sleeping peacefully in its car seat. She was holding a white paper bag that smelled of fried chicken and biscuits. She had driven to the diner down the road and spent some of the gas money she had left on a hot meal. She placed the bag on the bench near the station entrance. "I couldn't just leave," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you." She hurried back to her car and drove away, leaving another small monument to kindness in her wake. The sun had finally set, painting the bruised purple sky with streaks of orange and red. The fluorescent lights of the gas station flickered on, casting a lonely glow. Arthur walked over to the bench and sat down. He placed the bag of food beside him and took a slow sip of the hot coffee. He looked down at the vest he was wearing. The leather was cracked and worn, imbued with the spirit of the man who had given it to him and the brotherhood it represented. He was wrapped in their loyalty, their protection. He was seen. He was acknowledged. A quiet dignity settled over him, more warming than any coffee, more sustaining than any meal. In the distance, he could almost hear the faint, fading roar of the motorcycles, an echo on the wind, a promise that he now had a place to call, a family to count on. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place, but tonight, on the edge of a forgotten town, at a lonely gas station, a small measure of justice had been served, and a good man had been reminded that he was not forgotten.